And we are in Exodus chapter 6. It's been a couple weeks because the Posies being here for polishing the pulpit last week, but it was interesting that Joshua picked a lesson out of Exodus to do last week, so we still had a lesson from Exodus for Bible class, and maybe when we get to that chapter, I'll just say, well, remember what Joshua said. We can skip over that, but maybe it'll help me to get moving a little quicker. But we're in chapter 6, and the children of Israel have been enslaved in Egypt. There's another Pharaoh that's arisen that didn't know Joseph, and he's put them under hard bondage. And God has called to Moses to go to Egypt and to free his people, to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And so Moses was reluctant at first. He made excuses, didn't want to be the one to go, wanted God to send somebody else, said he wasn't a good speaker, that he wasn't anybody special. And so God took all those excuses away from him and told him, no, you're going to go. So they've come in to Pharaoh, and they've initially said to let God's people go, let God's firstborn Israel go, and Pharaoh has refused to do that. He's made their lives more miserable because he has put on them a heavier burden that they're going to have to gather their own straw now in order to make bricks, and that he doesn't want them to lessen their quota, their tally of bricks. And so he's made it more difficult on them. And so God had told Moses this is what was going to happen. He said, Pharaoh's not going to let you go right away. It's going to be with a heavy hand. It's going to be with a mighty hand. I'm going to have to show many wonders. I'm going to have to do a lot before Pharaoh is finally going to let you go. And so he told Moses that up front, but the people become discouraged. And Moses becomes discouraged because, he says, I went in to Pharaoh and I told him what you said, and things haven't gotten better, and I don't know why you sent me in the first place because, this didn't work. Well, God's going to tell him, look, it's all right. I've got this. It's going to happen. It's just going to take time. You got to stick with the plan. In verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Lord I was not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, in which they were strangers. And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord. And if you notice here in verse 2 and in verse 8, this whole pericope, or it's really a paragraph that is there, this whole paragraph, it begins with I am the Lord there in verse 2, and then it finishes with I am the Lord there in verse 8. Those are what we call bookends. That he bookends what's in between there by saying I am the, he's going to prove to them who he is. They're going to know who he is. And he uses his name here. He says in verse 3, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Lord, by my name Yahweh, I was not known to them. And so God here is revealing his personal name to them, that he's going to have a personal relationship, if you will, with the children of Israel. And that personal relationship requires, his personal name. And so he's going to make his personal name known to them at this time. And so he's revealing himself that he's the one who's going to lead them out of Egypt. And he's the one who's going to deliver them. And it's going to be with a mighty hand and with great judgments, he says. And so there's going to be the 10 plagues on Egypt that we're going to see when we get into chapter 7, that those are going to begin, the 10 plagues upon Egypt. But it's mighty things that God's going to do to convince the Egyptians to let the Israelite people go. Because Pharaoh's going to be stubborn about it. He's going to be hard-hearted about it. He's not going to be willing to let them go. But God's going to do that, and he says, by great judgments. Now, God's going to obviously execute judgment upon Egypt for what it is that they've done to his people, but he's going to execute judgment on all of those Egyptian gods. And we'll see that when we get into the plagues, that he executes that judgment. But this is what's known as the tetragrammaton, the four letters that are there, the Y, H, W, H, Yahweh, that the vowels have to be supplied for the name of God, which usually in our Bibles is just L-O-R-D, Lord, right, all in caps. And when you see that, that's usually that name. The Jews didn't want to use the name of God, and so they used Adonai instead, which is Lord, in their writings, and so they wouldn't use the name of God. They thought to use it was to make it a common thing and to take it in vain, and so they wouldn't use that. And so a lot of times in the Bible, depending on your translation, you'll usually see that as Lord, all in caps. And so God's going to redeem them from the Egyptians. He's going to redeem them from their bondage there. And once he redeems them, then they will be his people. Now that's that principle, right, is something that we see even today in the New Testament times. That when we are redeemed, right, when we are redeemed from our bondage to sin by the blood of Christ, that we then become God's people. And for them to be God's people, they've got to be redeemed, and he's going to be the one who's going to redeem them, or he's the one who's going to deliver them. And so you notice in verses 6 through 8, you've got, I think, 7 times where it says, I will, I will, I will, right? I will bring you out. I will rescue you. I will take you as my people. I will be your God, right? And so I will bring you into the land. So you've got God telling them here what it is that he's going to do. So they think that, well, this hasn't worked, right? Moses has gone into Pharaoh and we failed. This hasn't worked. Pharaoh hasn't let us go. Life has gotten more difficult, and God says, no, I'm going to do this. I will do this. And sometimes we tend to limit the power of God because we don't see maybe how we can do something. And so sometimes we doubt that God can do it. And I think that's the mode that the Israelites are in here. They don't see how they can get free from Egyptian bondage. Because they don't see how they can do it, they don't believe that God can. But God says, no, I can do this. God's more powerful, and we'll see that God rules over the nations, that God is more powerful than the nation of Egypt, that God is more powerful than nature, because he set all that up in the first place. Any comments or questions through this point? Some of this is a little bit of review from where we left off, I think, just to get us back into the mode of where we are, back into the context of where we are. In verse 9 it says, so Moses spoke thus to the children of Israel, but they did not heed Moses because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. So Moses says, look, God's going to bring us out, and the people are doubtful about that. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, go in, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, let the children of Israel go out of this land. And Moses spoke before the Lord, saying, the children of Israel have not heeded me. How then shall Pharaoh heed me? For I am of uncircumcised lips. Moses makes a similar excuse that he made earlier here when he says, look, these people, the Israelites, they don't even believe me when I tell them that God's going to bring them out. How is Pharaoh, right? Because Pharaoh, he's on a higher level. Right, the Israelites, I mean, they're just slaves, right? And the slaves don't believe me. If my own people don't believe me, well, then how is this foreign ruler, right, the lone ruler of the lone superpower in the world, how is it that he's going to hear what it is that I've got to say? But God had already told him that I'm going to let you work signs. I'm going to let you work wonders. I'm going to let you work miracles. You're going to be able to confirm the things that are going to take place. Now, the first time, in chapter 5, when Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh, they didn't work any sign or wonder or miracle. They just told him, God says, Yahweh says, let my people go. And Pharaoh tells him no. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in verse 13, gave them a command for the children of Israel and for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. So even though Moses is saying, look, I'm not anybody, I've got uncircumcised lips, I can't speak holy words because I'm human, right? And I make mistakes and I mess up. And that was kind of the same thought that Isaiah had when he was called, right? That he's a man of uncircumcised lips. And God says, no, God can use us, right? Even though we're not perfect, if we're faithful, there's a difference there between being faithful and being perfect. We're not going to be perfect, but we can still be faithful and God can still use us. And so God isn't accepting his excuse. He gives them a command that they're going to go. Now we've got this aside here, beginning in verse 14, where we've got some genealogical information that is given to us. It says, now these are the heads of their fathers' houses. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, were Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. These are the families of Reuben. And the sons of Simeon were Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jashan, Zohar, and Shual. Or Shual, yeah, I guess Shual. The son of a Canaanite woman. These are the families of Simeon. Now, Reuben and Simeon, they were the oldest, but if you remember, because of what happened with Joseph, right, they're not given that right, if you will, as the firstborn, right? That ends up falling all the way down to Judah. That the rod, right, the scepter is not going to depart from Judah. We're told in the book of Genesis. But we get their families here, but it's just very brief with regards to Reuben and Simeon because that's not where the focus is going to be in this particular text. The focus is going to be on the Levites and on a particular family of Levi. And so next he says, these are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And the years of the life of Levi were 137. The sons of Gershon were Libni and Shimei according to their families. The sons of Kohath were Amram, Ishar, Hebron, and Uzziel. And the years of the life of Kohath were 133. The sons of Merari were Mali and Mushi. These are the families of Levi according to their generations. And so he gives us the families of Levi. He gives us the Levite families because as we look at the rest of the Pentateuch, going from here through Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, these are the folks that are going to be central to the story. Notice the three sons of Levi here are mentioned, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. When you get over to Leviticus, those three families are split up as far as duties around the tabernacle. There were different duties. When they picked up the tabernacle to move, the Kohathites, the sons of Kohath, they were the ones that were to carry all of the holy items. They were to bear the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, on the poles, to carry it and move it about. And when they didn't do that, right, when David put it on a cart, and the oxen start to stumble, and Uzzah reaches out and grabs hold of the ark, and God strikes him. Why? Because they weren't following the instructions, right? It was supposed to be the Kohathites that were supposed to move that thing in the first place. Don't know whether Uzzah was a Kohathite or not, but they were supposed to bear that on their shoulders by the poles. They weren't supposed to put it on a cart and pull it with oxen. That wasn't what they were to do. But you've got these different duties that are delineated in the book of Leviticus based on these three families. Yes, sir? Yeah.
Eliminated him from the firstborn rights.
Yeah. Yeah, they had messed up, right?
The other two brothers had a history of anger and hatred.
Yeah, so they had some issues in Genesis, right? With what they did, and so God's going to choose Judah to be the tribe that the kings are going to come from. But the Levites are going to be special because the Levites are going to be the ones that are going to be the priests. They're the ones that are going to take care of the tabernacle once it's built. And so they're going to be central in the story. And so he mentions these folks. And then in verse 18, the sons of Kohath, well, you've got Amram there, who is Moses' father. And so Amram is a Kohathite. Which means that Moses is going to be a Kohathite, which means that Aaron's going to be a Kohathite, and they're going to be given the duty of taking care of those most holy things in the tabernacle once they're built. So when we talk about the altar of incense, and we talk about the menorah, we talk about the Ark of the Covenant, those things, it's going to be their responsibility. Good to see you, Doug. And so in verse 20, it tells us more about Amram, right? Because, again, these are the characters that are central to our story. Amram took for himself Jochebed, his father's sister, as wife. She bore him Aaron and Moses, and the years of the life of Amram were 137. So this is where we get the names of Moses' parents. Earlier, we're told that it was a Levite who took for himself a Levite woman in order to be his wife, and then she bore Moses for him. And so it's not until here that we find the names of Moses' parents. His father's name is Amram, his mother's name is Jochebed, and Aaron is his older brother. It says the sons of Ishar were Korah, Nepheg, and Zikri. Well, why does it mention them so much in here? Well, you've got Korah, right, who comes from Ishar. Ishar is a son of Kohath, and so Korah is a Kohathite. Now, the Kohathites, they've got an honored position, if you will, within the Levites, that they're the ones that get to carry that most holy stuff. It's sort of like when you go to Washington, D.C., if you've ever been to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, that's an honor guard. Whoever gets to march that post, it's an honor for them to be able to do that. Not every Marine gets to march that post. That's kind of for the best of the best, if you will, that they're honored in being able to do that. And so Korah and his group, they're in an honored position already. And if you remember what happens later in the story, Korah and his companions decide to rebel against Moses and Aaron. And Moses says, what do you want, the high priesthood as well? Is that what? Because that's the only thing that's left for him that would be any higher than where he is for him to be the high priest. He wasn't satisfied with his position. But that's we see that here with regards to this genealogy. When we put these things together, we can see who these characters are. And it also tells us that Korah is a cousin of Moses and Aaron. And so when he rebels against Moses and Aaron, he's rebelling against his cousins. It says in verse 22, the sons of Uzziel were Mishael, Elzaphan, and Zithri. In verse 23, Aaron took to himself Elisheba, daughter of Aminadab, sister of Nashon, as wife, and she bore him Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. And so we get the sons of Aaron here because, again, they're going to be central to the story. When we get over to Leviticus chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu are working there with their father as high priest, and they offered strange fire before the Lord. Fire came out from him and consumed Nadab and Abihu, right? They are killed because of they're worshiping God in a way that he has not commanded them to worship. God takes his commands seriously. And so we're given their information there, and then Eleazar and Ithamar next because, well, with Nadab and Abihu being killed, Eleazar is next in line to be the high priest. The high priesthood's going to go through the family of Aaron. So from Aaron it goes to Eleazar as the next high priest. Verse 24, the sons of Korah were Asir, Elkanah, and Abiasaph. These are the families of the Korahites. He mentions the sons of Korah here because in Korah's rebellion, there's some other folks that go along with them, and their families are there with them and standing there at the door of their tent. They're kind of all together, but Korah's sons apparently are not there. Korah's sons apparently do not follow Korah in his rebellion. And so when the earth opens up and swallows them up, the sons of Korah are not part of that group. And how do we know that? Well, because the Bible tells us so later on, but it also tells us that some of the Psalms are written by the sons of Korah. And so they play a role later on, and so it's just interesting that the genealogy here happens to mention them. It doesn't mention all of the folks, but it mentions these folks that are going to be central players in the story from here on through the rest of the Pentateuch, and in some cases further on through the Bible. Eleazar, Aaron's son, took for himself one of the daughters of Putiel as wife, and she bore him Phinehas. These are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites according to their families. And so Eleazar, as I said, he's going to be high priest after Aaron. Well, after Eleazar, it goes to his first son, which is Phinehas. Phinehas doesn't have a brother named Ferb. For those of you that are into Disney cartoons, Ferb was adopted anyways. But Phinehas, as the oldest son of Eleazar, he's going to be high priest later. But you might remember Phinehas. He's the one which, when the children of Israel are committing idolatry because of Balaam's counsel, that Phinehas is the one who takes a spear and he drives it through the man and the woman as they are in the act of committing fornication. And because of his zeal, the Lord stops the plague that had taken place upon the people. And so we get these central characters introduced to us in this genealogy. Any comments or questions on these things? A lot of this is later on in the story in other books, but other parts of the Pentateuch, but they're being introduced here. And if you read the Pentateuch as a whole, then you can kind of see that, God's got a plan to the story even, that he introduces these characters because they're going to be involved in the story later on. Nothing happens there by accident. Now, with regards to Aaron and Moses being the sons of Amram, it says in verse 26, "These are the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, 'Bring out the children of Israel from the land of Egypt according to their armies.'" In case you thought it was a different Moses and Aaron, he's clarifying for us, this is the Moses and Aaron who went into Pharaoh. These are the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring out the children of Israel from Egypt. These are the same Moses and Aaron. "And it came to pass on the day that the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'I am the Lord, speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you.' But Moses said before the Lord, 'Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips, and how shall Pharaoh heed me?'" I don't think that Moses says this twice. I think Moses says this once. It's mentioned that Moses says this, and then we've got kind of this in verse 13, right? Verse 12. Moses says, how can I speak to Pharaoh? The children of Israel won't listen to me. I'm of uncircumcised lips. And then we've got this aside with the genealogy that's here. And then Moses is the writer, right? He's bringing us back here to tell us, well, this is the Moses who said, "How shall I go into Pharaoh because I'm of uncircumcised lips?" So he's bringing us back from this deviation or this aside that he has here with the genealogy to tell us that, well, here's where we are in our story, right? Kind of brings us back to where we were there in verse 12. Any comments or questions on these things? All right, so the Lord wants Moses to go, and he says, this time we're going to be successful because there's going to be signs and wonders that are going to accompany what it is that Moses says. There's going to be plagues upon Egypt that are finally going to convince Pharaoh to let the children of Israel go. And so it's going to work this time. So in verse 1 of chapter 7, the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall tell Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of this land." God says Moses is God's prophet in this, right? He is speaking for God. But God says, I'm going to make you like your God, right? Because you're going to speak what God tells him to speak. And then Aaron is going to be his mouthpiece. Aaron's going to be his prophet, if you will. But that God's going to give Moses the authority. He's going to give him the ability to be able to do these various different things to tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. Verse 3 says, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt." Now, God says that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Doesn't specify how that's going to happen or how that's going to take place. We'll talk about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart once we get to the end of the plagues and how that happened. Notice it's future tense, though. God says, "I will harden his heart." Before God hardens Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh hardens his own heart several times before then the text tells us that God hardened his heart. Now God says he's going to give Pharaoh the strength, he's going to give him the will, if you will, to be able to resist what it is that Moses says. But God doesn't force Pharaoh. Pharaoh still makes his own decisions. It's not until Pharaoh has hardened his heart several times that the text then tells us that God is hardening his heart. And what we might say about that is, you've got one son, right? And that son either melts butter or bakes clay. And it's the same son, right? It either softens the heart or it hardens the heart. And Pharaoh's of the character that he has, that when, because of his stubbornness, when he sees that things are going against him, he digs his heels in even more. He becomes even more stubborn when he sees that it's not going his way. And while it's not exactly the same, I guess it's kind of similar when I was a kid, my brother and I and my cousins, we'd get together at my grandparents' house and we'd always go down in the basement and we started off with Atari, and we played Atari football and then we progressed as the other games came out. But we would always go downstairs and play Atari football. Well, I had one cousin he was pretty good at Atari football, but I knew that if I could get him to make one mistake, that I could beat him. Because he'd make one mistake, he'd throw his joystick down, he'd get all angry, he'd get all tensed up and stubborn, and he would just continue to mess up. And once he made that first mistake, you knew you had him beat, right? Well, Pharaoh's kind of that same way. He's kind of like a stubborn little kid that when he sees that things are going against him, he's not willing to admit that he's wrong. He's not willing to admit that what he's doing isn't right and that he should listen to the Lord, and he just digs his heels in deeper and deeper and deeper, even to the point where his people say to him, don't you know that Egypt is destroyed? Why are you continuing to hold on? Let these folks go. So God tells Moses, you're going to speak all that I tell you. I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and I'm going to multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. So God says there's going to be great judgments. He's going to execute judgment upon Egypt. He's going to execute judgment upon their gods. These things are not done just so that God can show off his power. There's a purpose to this. In verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand. You know, when the Israelites come out, there's a mixed multitude of folks that come out with them. It's not just the children of Israel that leave Egypt. There's other folks that are going to see what happens in Egypt. They're going to realize that this is God, and they're going to go along with the Israelites when they leave Egypt. And so God's got a purpose here. He's going to show Israel who he is. He's going to show Egypt who he is. He's revealing himself as Yahweh and his great might and his great power. But it's for us too, right? It's for all the world to know that he's God.
I just wanted to bring up one little thing about the hardening of the heart. From the get-go, Pharaoh's heart was hardened of his own accord, simply because God exists and opposes Pharaoh. Right?
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
So if that is the case, could it not also be the case that in verse, verse 3, can it not also be the case that that is what is still going on despite the way the language reads there?
Well,
In other words, what I'm saying is it possible that God does not force it on him, but Pharaoh is just continuing with what he's been doing?
yeah, Pharaoh's continuing with what he's been doing. God gives him the strength to resist, right? But it's kind of the fact that God is commanding him, right? God is commanding him. He's not saying, I suggest to you, or would you consider, or can we take a vote, right? God's telling him, let my people go. It's a command, right? And so God is commanding Pharaoh. Well, the fact that he's sending a command to him, the fact that he sends Aaron and Moses, right, with this message from God to let his people go, that's one of the things that causes him to harden his heart, because he's like, well, who are you guys, right? In verse 2 of chapter 5, who is Yahweh that I should obey his voice, right? I don't know who Yahweh is. I don't know who the Lord is. Why should I listen? He's got no authority here, right? So Pharaoh kind of hardens his own heart. But his heart gets hardened because God is commanding him to do something. And he's like, I'm not going to accept any commands from anybody else. Right? I'm the guy that's in charge. And so he hardens his own heart to the point of where if he gives in now, he's going to lose face, right? He's going to lose prestige. He's got to be looking to be in control of this somehow. And Pharaoh's going to try to control this. He's going to try to limit the damage by saying, all right, go ahead and have a sacrifice, but do it here, right? Go have a sacrifice, but don't go very far, right? Go ahead and go, but don't take the children and the women with you. So Pharaoh's going to try to control this thing to make it look like he's still in charge, even though at some point he's got to be able to clearly see he isn't. Yes, sir.
I'm always fascinated by the way the Bible describes God, and he's kind of proud of being invisible. The gods of Egypt, they had statues, idols, you could go up and see them.
Yeah.
And I've always been kind of fascinated with that whole idea that, and Moses is the most meek man on the face of the earth, according to the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So this really meek guy goes in and tells the president, hey,
Yeah.
here's what you got to do.
Yeah.
And how do I know? Because this invisible guy told me.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, he's an 80-year-old shepherd at this particular moment in time, right? And so, yeah, you're the ruler of the world, right? And an 80-year-old shepherd comes in and says, you need to let all your slaves go. You need to let all your manpower go. Yeah, he doesn't take that well, right? Doesn't take that well. So there's a purpose to this, right? The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt to bring the children of Israel from among them. And Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded them, so they did. That's always a good response to what it is that the Lord wants, right? The Lord wanted them to do something. They kind of resisted. Moses resisted. Moses offered excuses. But now we're going to see over and over and over again that Moses did what the Lord commanded him to do. And that's always the best response. And it says Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. And so we get their ages here at this particular time. We see Aaron is 3 years older than Moses, but Moses is an old man. He spent 40 years in Egypt, right, living in the house of Pharaoh's daughter. He spent 40 years in Midian as a shepherd, and now he's 80 years old and he's coming into Pharaoh and saying, here's what the Lord has said. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, show a miracle for yourselves, then you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it before Pharaoh and let it become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh, and they did so, just as the Lord commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. But Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, so the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. For every man threw down his rod, and they became serpents, but Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord had said. So he says, when Pharaoh asks you to show a sign or to show a miracle, right, prove that God has spoken to you, you throw down your rod and you let it become a serpent. Now that was one of the things that God had shown him in the wilderness there. When Moses was hesitant to go in, he says, I'm going to be able to work signs and miracles through you so that they're going to know that God has sent you, right? And so he throws his rod down now, and it becomes a serpent. And we might think that's kind of amazing, right? That a stick turns into a snake or it turns into a serpent. But it says that Pharaoh called his magicians and his sorcerers, and they did the same thing with their enchantments. Now, it doesn't tell us who these characters are. It doesn't give a name to these sorcerers and magicians here. But in Jewish folklore, if you will, or in Jewish history and in their verbal history, they knew the names of these two gentlemen, or at least two of these magicians and sorcerers. But we don't have it here. We actually have it over in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 8. So if we come over to 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 8, Paul is warning Timothy here about false teachers that he has to deal with, and he's making a comparison with regards to the false teachers that he's dealing with. In verse 7, he says, these folks are always learning. They're never able to come to a knowledge of the truth, and maybe you've dealt with somebody like that, or you've talked to somebody like that. They're always learning something new, but they never come to any conclusions. And he says in verse 8, now as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, so do these also resist the truth, men of corrupt minds disapproved concerning the faith. And so we get the name of a couple of these magicians here in 2 Timothy chapter 3, Jannes and Jambres, that they resisted Moses. And the idea here is they resisted Moses even though at some point they could see what the truth was. They could understand what they're doing, right? Maybe they're doing it by sleight of hand. It could be that they hypnotized those snakes somehow to be stiff, right? And they used them as rods, and then when they cast them down, they went back to their snake form. If you will, that they woke up from being hypnotized. There could be some sort of sleight of hand there that's at work, but it doesn't tell us exactly how that happens. It could be some sort of illusion or sleight of hand. It could be some sort of black magic. It appears that when the children of God have the ability to work the miraculous, that Satan and his demons also have a certain amount of power to be able to possess people in the first century. You've got demon possession, but they were able to cast demons out at that time. And so it may be that these folks, that they're doing something by the power of the devil. It could be that some of these demons that allowed them to do these things may have been the idols that they were worshiping or the gods that they were worshiping. There could be something to that. Now, I don't just say that to say it. Look over at Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 2. Zechariah is at the end of the Old Testament, just before the Spanish prophet Malachi. That's Malachi. But in Zechariah, if I could get my pages to turn here, in Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 2, It says, "It shall be in that day, says the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they shall no longer be remembered. I will also cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to depart from the land." There's going to come a time where God is going to get rid of the unclean spirits that are in the land, and to allow unclean spirits to have power, to allow demon possession to continue once the age of miracles passes and there's no way for the children of God to be able to cast those things out. God wouldn't do that, right? And Zechariah 13:2, there's a prophecy there that God isn't going to do that. At some point, he's going to cast those, he's going to remove that power from the land so that they're no longer going to be able to do those things. And so, was what they did sleight of hand, or was there something more to it? Can't tell from the text. It doesn't tell us explicitly, but it looks like there could be something more to it than just a sleight of hand. But there's a point at which they realize that God's got a power that they don't have. Because whose staff swallowed up the other ones? Right? Aaron's rod, his serpent, swallowed up all the other serpents and then turned back. That should have told him who was superior. Right, that should have gave them a pecking order, right? That they were more powerful. That God was more powerful than what it was that they were doing through whatever means they were doing it. But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, it says in verse 13. Now, so his heart grows hard. He hardens his own heart here in verse 13. And you can maybe put yourself in Pharaoh's shoes and say, well, he turned his rod into a snake, but you know what? My magicians can do that too. So how do I know that what Moses and Aaron did isn't just some sort of magic trick? And so Pharaoh's not going to give in, right? He's stubborn. He's not going to give in. And so the plagues at this point on Egypt are going to begin, the 10 plagues of Egypt. And you see, I got a slideshow for the 10 plagues, and we've got 4 minutes, and we're not going to get through 10 plagues in 4 minutes. But the plagues here are going to begin because the first plague is because Pharaoh won't let the people go. In verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning when he goes out to the water, and you shall stand by the river's bank to meet him. And the rod which was turned to a serpent you shall take in your hand. And you shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But indeed until now you would not hear. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned into blood. And the fish that are in the river shall die, the river shall stink, and the Egyptians will loathe to drink the water of the river." Now, he's kind of announcing that this is going to happen, that this is going to take place. But there are other plagues where Moses comes in and he says, if you don't let my people go, here's what's going to happen. Well, Pharaoh's already said no, he's not going to let the people go. So this first plague is going to happen. He's going to turn the water into blood by striking it. And when he strikes it, the river's going to turn to blood and all the fish are going to die and it's going to stink. Now, I don't know if you've ever lived close to water. I grew up near Lake Erie, and if you went up to the beach and there was 1 or 2 dead fish that were up on the beach, you could smell them. You could smell them on the whole beach, right? And as you got closer, that smell and then you could see, oh yeah, there's this rotting fish over here. That's where that smell is coming from. I can't imagine if all the fish on the lake died at the same time and were washed up and were rotting on shore or just floating right in the water. I can't imagine what that would smell like. But that would have to be horrible. And so Moses says, here's what it is that's going to happen. So he tells Pharaoh in the morning, right? Pharaoh would go down to the Nile maybe to bathe in the morning. That was a typical thing that the Egyptians would go down to the Nile to bathe. They thought that would bring them fertility by bathing in the Nile. They saw the Nile River as being a god, or several gods associated with the Nile River. But the Nile River was basically the lifeblood of Egypt. You didn't live very far from the Nile because you needed the water, you needed the irrigation. If you were going to grow anything, if you were going to have any water to drink, you had to be close to the Nile River. And so that being their lifeblood, well, that water is going to be turned into blood, right? Verse 19, the Lord spoke to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your rod, stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their streams, over their rivers, over their ponds, over all their pools of water, that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in buckets of wood and pitchers of stone." Moses and Aaron did so just as the Lord commanded. So he lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh and the sight of his servants, and the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. Fish that were in the river died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water of the river, so there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Then the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord had said. Now, Pharaoh's magicians, they're able to turn water into blood as well. I don't know how you know that his magicians are doing it and that God didn't do it, right? Because all the water is in the process of being turned into blood. But you know, if you're Pharaoh, you might say, hey, this isn't really helping any, right? This isn't helping much. You're turning more water into blood. Okay, that's great. Can you turn it back? Right? Can you reverse it? Can you turn the blood back into water? Well, they're obviously not able to do that. But again, Pharaoh may think, well, this is just some sort of magic trick because his magicians can apparently do the same thing that Moses and Aaron are doing. And so again, his heart grew hard. He did not heed them, just as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, neither was his heart moved by this. So all the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink, because they could not drink the water of the river. And 7 days passed after the Lord struck the river. So it looks like this lasts for 7 days. They've got to dig and find new sources of water because every source of water that they have has been corrupted. And so when we look at this water turning to blood, there are several different Egyptian gods that are defeated in this. Osiris was the judge of the dead, had something to do with the Nile, that blood is associated with death. Hapi was the Nile god. And so they had a specific god that was just in charge of the Nile River. There was Setet, who was the god of the annual inundation. So they had a god that was kind of in charge of the annual flood that they needed in order to irrigate their land for being able to grow things. And so they had this god. And there were 30 other so-called gods that were associated with the Nile. And so by turning the Nile into blood, by turning the water into blood, God is defeating all of these so-called Egyptian deities. But Pharaoh is not ready to let the children of Israel go. It's going to take more than this. This is the first plague. There's 9 more. Yes, sir.
Some people have to be totally broken before they'll submit to God.
Yeah. It's going to have to be a total, complete loss before Pharaoh is going to finally give in. And that's what God told Moses at the very beginning. It's going to take a strong hand. It's going to take a strong hand to get him to let you go. And when he does let you go, he's going to let you go with a strong, he's going to drive you out of there. He's going to want you out of there yesterday when he finally gets around to that point. But it's going to take a while. It's going to take 9 more plagues. Thank you for your attention and comments. We'll pick up from here next week, Lord willing.